Probably the most talked about emergency, although it is uncommon, is an engine failure. In this lesson, you will learn the ABCs of what to do if your engine ever does fail. First, if you change something just before the engine quit, change it back. Undoing whatever it was may cause the engine to run again. An example of this would be if the engine failed when you pulled back on the throttle. In this case, you should push the throttle back in immediately. At this point, you really don't want to figure out why the engine failed when you pulled back on the throttle. You just want the engine running. So pushing in the throttle may get it running again. The second thing to do is to accept the fact that the engine has quit, because disbelief can keep you from acting promptly. And now that you believe your engine has quit, think ABC, where A stands for airspeed. Establish the correct pitch attitude for your best glide airspeed. B stands for best field. You must find a place to land just in case your engine doesn't start again. And C stands for cockpit checks. You want to try to get that engine started again. Now, you're going to be somewhat busy because you want to be simultaneously finding some place to land and also trying to restart the engine, all while still flying the airplane. Now let's talk about the ABCs in depth. First, A for airspeed. In the case of the Skyhawk, the speed you want is 65 knots indicated airspeed. Why? Because this is the best glide speed. In other words, this speed will let you fly the farthest distance for the amount of altitude you have. The distance increases as the altitude goes up here. The way to maintain this speed is to establish the correct pitch attitude. Notice that this chart is for when you are at 65 knots indicated airspeed, the propeller is windmilling, the flaps are up, and there is zero wind. If you don't meet all these conditions, your glide distance will not be as shown. Next, B is for best field. You must decide where you're going to go and get the airplane headed there. Pick a landing spot, something within gliding distance. But how do you tell what's within gliding distance? Well, it must be below the center of the windshield and not move up higher as you fly toward it. If possible, pick a landing spot that is upwind from you. That way, when you get there, you won't have to try to turn around to land into the wind. And remember from when you did your ground reference maneuvers how to tell which way the wind is blowing. You watch the flags, the smoke, etc. Some possible landing spots are roads, but beware of possible automobile traffic and wires and poles along the roadside. What about fields? Well, they could be good, but consider whether tall crops like corn or plowed furrows will be a factor. In fact, if you do pick a field, try to land in the same direction as the furrows. Another place might be a dry lake bed. They're usually flat, but the surface may be a little soft. And if you're landing on a beach, land in the wet sand near the water's edge. The sand will be firmer there, and you have less chance of getting sunbathers' cocoa butter on your landing gear. And finally, the C is for cockpit checks. A good way to quickly check the essential items in an emergency is to develop a flow procedure. One good way to do this is to start on the floor with the fuel selector valve and make sure that it is set to both. Then move up to the fuel shutoff valve and make sure that it is in. Then up to the mixture and push it in, except at high altitudes, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. Then you should move over to the auxiliary fuel pump switch and make sure that you turn it on. And finally, move to the left and make sure the ignition switch is set to both. You should practice this smooth flow at a deliberate pace so that in a real emergency, it comes to you automatically. After you've done your flow, it's a good time to redirect your attention to the situation outside. Hey, how's your airplane's attitude? Is the landing area picked out about the same place on the windshield or moving down, indicating that you're going to make it to the landing area okay? If everything is all right, and assuming the engine has not restarted, if you have time, You can pick up the aircraft checklist and make sure you haven't overlooked anything. As we discussed, you should have already done, at a minimum, the boldface memory items, but you should recheck them to make sure that you haven't skipped anything. Now, let's talk about some of these checklist items. The first step under the engine failure during flight restart procedures is airspeed 65 knots indicated. As we already discussed, this is the Skyhawk's best glide airspeed. Right here, 65 knots. Now, there are only two things that you can fix to get the engine running again. One is a fuel problem, and the other is an ignition problem. A fuel problem is most likely the reason for your engine failure. That's why the next 4 checklist items all deal with the fuel. And again, they're memory items. You'll want to check anything associated with fuel or fuel delivery. Checklist item number 2 is fuel shutoff valve on, which means you push it in fully. You don't want to just look at it. You want to push it in physically, because it may look in, but it may be out just enough to cut off the fuel. And you may be thinking, well, how could it not be in? I've been flying along okay up to now. Well, maybe someone caught a camera case or a luggage strap on it and pulled it out partly without even knowing it. All right, the next checklist item is fuel selector valve to both. This is to make sure that you didn't empty one tank but still have it selected. Selecting both tanks gives you access to any fuel that's in the airplane, unless it's in a can on the seat behind you. The next checklist item is auxiliary fuel pump switch on. You turn this on just in case the engine-driven fuel pump is not working and the old gravity feed is not keeping up. And the last fuel-related and last boldface memory item is mixture rich if restart has not occurred. You should push the mixture to full rich. Maybe the engine quit because you leaned it out at altitude and didn't richen it when you started to descend. Now, in spite of what the checklist says, if you are at high altitude, you may not want to push the mixture to full rich. That's because a full rich mixture at high altitude may also cause the engine to quit. So you got to be careful with that. The last checklist item deals with the ignition system. Ignition switch set to both or start. This is saved until last because it wouldn't make much sense to try to start the engine if you weren't getting fuel to it. Now, if the propeller is windmilling, but the engine is not running, you should check the magnetos. You should check each switch position, start with the right, because one switch may have failed, and the engine may run on one position, but not on another. And now, ladies and gentlemen, you've finished the checklist. But there is one thing I need to add, and that is when you're flying an airplane with a carburetor, carburetor ice is the most likely cause of your engine failure. So you will need to pull the carburetor heat as soon as possible after the engine failure. If you wait, the engine may cool too much and not have enough heat to melt away any ice in the carburetor. Now remember, your primary job is to fly the airplane. The best way to do this is to do your flow procedure even while you're looking for a place to land, because you don't want to spend all your time looking for a place to land when all you had to do was push in the fuel shutoff valve to get the engine running. But on the other hand, you don't want to get so caught up doing things inside the cockpit that when you realize the engine is not going to start, you don't have a place to land. And if you don't get through the flow procedure, remember, the first thing to do is fly the airplane, and that includes doing a controlled landing. And we'll talk about how to do a controlled landing coming up next.